Visualize a sovereign so hungry for domination, so obsessed with absolute command, that she converted an entire nation into her theater of atrocities. A figure whose name crossed centuries as a symbol of corruption, artifice, and blasphemy. But what was the path that led her to such depravity, and what was the cost she bore for confronting the Creator? You are about to dive into the terrifying saga of Jezebel, a chronicle of supremacy, deadly stratagems, bloodshed, and a pronounced sentence that materialized in every frightening fragment. This is an account that transcended millennia, a warning that resonates to our times about the risks of unbridled greed and the vanity that precedes collapse. Her roots were not in Israelite soil. Jezebel was born as royal heir in distant lands, daughter of the monarch of Sidon, immersed from childhood in the macabre rituals dedicated to Baal and Asherah. When she crossed the borders toward the territory of Israel, she did not arrive as just any wife. She arrived as an invader camouflaged under a bridal veil. Her baggage contained not only fine fabrics and precious stones, but a sinister mission that would forever redefine the course of an entire people. King Ahab, a weak leader, easily bewitched by promises of greatness and by the fascination of a woman who perfectly mastered the art of persuasion. And what was Jezebel's true desire? Total dominion, not simply over a spouse, but over an entire civilization. She quickly identified that Ahab was a puppet, awaiting someone who knew how to manipulate the invisible strings. While the population of Israel witnessed, she initiated the construction of her trap, layer by layer. Initially, she imported her own religious leaders, next, her deities, and then she began to extinguish any trace of the true God of Israel. Each maneuver was meticulously planned, each movement a play on a lethal board where she aimed for definitive triumph over the conviction of an entire society. What happens when a monarch determines that her deity is the only one deserving of veneration? Absolute dread. Jezebel did not request consent. She decreed the construction of profane sanctuaries at every crossroads. She ordered the bringing of 450 worshippers of Baal and 400 followers of Asherah, sustaining them with palace resources while the genuine messengers of God were pursued without mercy. The metamorphosis was violent and methodical, a spiritual purge conducted with military efficiency and planned coldness. Imagine servants of the Most High hidden in caves, escaping under the cloak of darkness, murmuring supplications fearing they would be captured. Entire lineages devastated. Jezebel's blade knew no compassion. The territory that once experienced the magnificence of David and Solomon now agonized under the yoke of apostasy. The public roads reverberated with pagan melodies. The aroma of incense lit for inert idols contaminated the atmosphere, and at the epicenter of this perversion, installed in her seat of authority, Jezebel displayed satisfaction. She had triumphed, or so she imagined. However, in her presumption, she underestimated an essential reality. God does not forsake his own, and his retribution, although sometimes delayed, invariably manifests itself. But heaven did not remain indifferent. Suddenly, a figure emerges, indomitable, covered with rustic pelts. His name, Elijah. And he carried a declaration: "There shall be no dew nor rain these years, according to my word." With that simple sentence, yet impregnated with celestial authority, the spiritual conflict was formally initiated. 3 long years. 3 years without a single drop of water from the heavens. The territory withered under the drought, and Jezebel perfectly identified the culprit. And then the provocation, Mount Carmel, a duel that would determine the outcome of everything. On one flank, the 450 worshippers of Baal, leaping, vociferating, mutilating themselves with blades, begging that their divinity would project celestial flames. It was an exhibition of affliction, a lamentable demonstration of an empty belief trying to conjure a God incapable of listening, incapable of reacting, incapable of existing. Elijah contemplated and ridiculed. Cry more intensely. Perhaps he is napping or absent on a journey. Hours transpired. Absolutely nothing. Sepulchral muteness from the firmaments. The dishonor was tangible, the failure unquestionable, and the people began to comprehend the reality that Jezebel had tried to suffocate. Then Elijah advanced. He restored the divine altar. He arranged the wood, the offering, and to guarantee complete certainty that there was no artifice, he drenched everything with water. Once, twice, 3 times, and then he supplicated. A simple invocation, objective. Manifest yourself, Lord, manifest yourself. There were no hysterical vociferations. There were no frenetic contortions. There was no self-mutilation, only a confident prayer of a man who recognized his God. Flames, celestial flames that consumed not only the offering, but the wood, the rocks, the soil, even the water in the ditches evaporated. The multitude prostrated themselves. The Lord is God, the Lord is God. The obscurity had been vanquished, or had it? Because spiritual triumphs, however extraordinary they may be, do not always transform souls hardened by pride and ambition. When Jezebel was informed of what occurred, when she discovered that her priests had been eliminated, she did not shed tears. She did not demonstrate repentance. She promised retaliation. She sent an emissary to Elijah with an icy message. Tomorrow, at this same hour, I will make your existence equal to that of each one of them. It was a simple, frontal intimidation, but loaded with all the hatred of a woman who recognized no boundaries to her hunger for supremacy and command. And something fractured inside Elijah. The man who had confronted an entire empire, who had invoked fire from the heavens, escaped. He ran to the wilderness, hid under a tree, and begged for death. Jezebel had conquered again, not through physical force, but through psychological terror. She demonstrated that occasionally the precise words, pronounced at the adequate instant, can be more devastating than 1,000 blades. But every narrative possesses an instant, a milestone where perversity surpasses a barrier that cannot be reversed. For Jezebel, that instant had an identity: Naboth. This would be the crime that would seal her destiny irreversibly, the transgression that would cry out to the heavens for vindication until divine retribution was executed. Naboth was a humble citizen. He possessed an agricultural property adjacent to the palace. Ahab coveted it. He presented a proposal, but Naboth declined. For what reason? Because that property represented his patrimony, the legacy of his previous generations. For him, it was out of negotiation. Ahab returned to the palace and reacted like a spoiled infant. For a man so weak of essence, a simple refusal was an intolerable affront that he could not process. And it was at that moment that Jezebel revealed who truly held command. She drafted correspondence in the name of the monarch. She forged his signet. She architected a fraudulent trial. She corrupted witnesses to incriminate Naboth for blasphemy against God and the sovereign. And Naboth, he was dragged beyond the city walls and stoned until he perished. His descendants were also assassinated so that there would be no successors, all for a rural property. It was a calculated homicide, executed with the indifference of one who eliminates an insect without a trace of remorse or hesitation. When Jezebel communicated the news to Ahab, she did not exhibit guilt. She merely declared icily, "Arise and appropriate Naboth's property." This was the apex, the irreversible point. At that instant, she had crossed an invisible but absolute frontier, and the heavens registered her condemnation with permanent ink. But God observed every detail. Elijah, who had escaped, was commissioned back with a prophetic revelation. He found Ahab in the usurped property and proclaimed, "In the identical location where the dogs tasted Naboth's blood, the dogs will taste your blood. And concerning Jezebel, the dogs will consume her in the vicinity of the wall of Jezreel." These were words that seemed like fantasy, like prophetic hyperbole, but that would prove themselves terribly literal. Jezebel heard this revelation and scoffed. She had survived obstacles before. She believed she would survive this one too. Years transpired. Ahab perished precisely as was prophesied. But Jezebel, she remained in authority, until one day a new monarch ascended to the throne, Jehu, a man with an assignment. And Jezebel, in her arrogance, did not perceive that the time of clemency had expired and the day of vengeance had finally dawned. When he reached the palace, Jezebel was at the window. She painted her eyes, she arranged her hair. Even in her last instant, she tried to utilize her appearance, her seduction, her prestige. But Jehu had no interest in manipulations. "Who positions themselves on my side?" he shouted. 2 or 3 eunuchs appeared at the window. "Throw her down!" And they threw her. There was no vacillation, there was no deliberation, there was no ultimate opportunity, only the cold execution of a judgment that had been pronounced years before. Jezebel's blood splattered on the walls, on the animals. Jehu trampled her body and entered to feed himself. Later, when he ordered that she be buried, after all she was a monarch's daughter, they discovered that the dogs had already consumed almost everything. Only the skull, the feet, and the palms of the hands remained. Precisely as was prophesied, the woman who once controlled monarchs and territories was reduced to unrecognizable fragments, devoured by wild animals, a death as humiliating as it was violent. But there is something additional in this story that needs to be unveiled. Because Jezebel was not merely an antagonist of an ancient chronicle, she transformed into an emblem, an archetype. Her name crossed millennia, being whispered in warnings used to describe manipulation, malign seduction, and apostasy. But for what reason? What was so special, or rather so terrible about her that made her name echo through generations? The answer resides in the essence of her power and in the way she exercised it. You see, Jezebel did not brandish a sword. She did not command armies. Her power was more subtle, more poisonous. She comprehended that to control a territory, you do not need to be the monarch. You need to control the monarch. Ahab possessed the title, the crown, the throne. But who truly governed? Who deliberated? Who moved the pieces on the board? This is the most dangerous power of all, the invisible power that manipulates without being perceived, that commands without being recognized. When Ahab desired Naboth's property and was rejected, he simply gave up. He lay down in bed, turned his face to the wall and threw a tantrum. Pathetic for a monarch, isn't it? But Jezebel looked at that weak man and glimpsed an opportunity. "Are you not now the one who governs Israel?" she questioned, not as a genuine inquiry, but as a cruel reminder. You may be the monarch, but you are so weak that you cannot even get what you desire. And then she showed how real power functions. It was a brutal lesson in psychological domination and political manipulation. She did not need to contaminate her own hands. She used the system. She manipulated the norms. She corrupted the leaders. She brought false witnesses. And she destroyed an innocent man without ever leaving her marks on the crime. This is the true face of sophisticated perversity. It is not always brutal and obvious. Sometimes it wears clothes of authority, speaks the language of law, and kills with official documents and royal seals. It is bureaucratic, systemic evil that hides behind institutional legitimacy. But here is something we rarely question. Where were the people during all this? Where were the city leaders when Naboth was falsely incriminated? They knew. Obviously they knew. But they remained mute. Where were the neighbors when Naboth was dragged to be stoned? They witnessed, but did not intervene. Where was Israel when God's messengers were hunted and assassinated? The people observed and chose the protection of silence. Silent complicity is frequently as destructive as active perversity. Jezebel could not have executed what she did in isolation. She needed an entire territory of people who opted to look away, who preferred their own tranquility to justice, who said to themselves, "It's not my problem, I won't get involved." And this is a frightening lesson for us today. Evil does not need to convert everyone. It only needs the good to remain silent. Tyranny prospers not by the strength of tyrants, but by the weakness of those who could resist but choose not to do so. But let's go even deeper. Let's go inside Jezebel's mind. What makes a person become this? Was she born cruel, or was cruelty cultivated? Remember, Jezebel grew up in Sidon, daughter of a monarch priest of Baal. From childhood, she was instructed that power is everything, that the divinities favor the strong, that compassion is weakness. Her education was a survival manual in a brutal world, where mercy was seen as vulnerability and kindness as naivety. She probably witnessed human sacrifices, bloody rituals. She was instructed that to get what you want from the divinities you need to pay in blood, in pain, in absolute submission, and then she is sent to marry a foreign monarch, torn from her land, from her family, placed in a territory that worships a God she was taught to despise, a God who prohibits exactly everything she learned to consider sacred. Imagine the cultural shock, the internal conflict, the sensation of being in enemy territory from the first day. She could have adapted, she could have learned, she could have chosen a different path, but no. Jezebel decided that she would not be transformed. She would transform Israel. And here is the terrible part. She almost succeeded. If it were not for Elijah, for Jehu, for those few who refused to bow, Israel would have been completely transformed. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob could have been forgotten. The promise of a Messiah, lost. One woman, almost erased centuries of sacred history. A single individual, armed with nothing more than determination and lack of scruples, almost rewrote the destiny of an entire nation. And what about those last moments, when Jehu arrived at the palace? Most people, when they see death approaching, beg, cry, ask for mercy. But Jezebel, she painted her eyes, she arranged her hair, she adorned herself as if going to a party. It was a last act of defiance, a final refusal to show weakness, even in the face of the inevitable. There is something simultaneously impressive and terrifying about this. Until her last breath, she refused to bow. She refused to show fear. She refused to admit defeat. When she looked out the window at Jehu, she did not beg for her life. Instead, she mocked. Did Zimri have peace, murderer of his lord? A reference to another usurper who had died tragically. Even knowing she was going to die, she chose to mock her executioner. Is this courage? Or is it madness? Or perhaps it is the final demonstration of a pride so deep, so rooted, that it prefers death to the humiliation of asking for forgiveness. It is the perfect portrait of a soul that chose pride until the end, even when that end was a literal fall from a window. So, in the end, what do we really learn from Jezebel? First, power without principles is a path to destruction. You can rise high. You can control kingdoms. You can make kings dance on your strings. But if your foundation is rotten, your fall is inevitable. History is full of examples of people who rose without ethics and fell with a crash. Second, influence is more powerful than force. Jezebel never led an army, but almost destroyed a nation. She never held a sword, but spilled rivers of blood. Be careful who you allow to influence your decisions. The people who whisper in your ear can have more impact on your life than those who shout in your face. Third, the silence of the good is the fertile ground where evil flourishes. Jezebel did not do everything alone. She had help from people who knew it was wrong, but chose not to act. Each person who turned their back, each elder who closed their eyes, each neighbor who remained quiet, contributed to her reign of terror. Fourth, pride is the precursor to the fall. Jezebel had countless opportunities to change. After Mount Carmel, after Ahab's death, after Elijah's prophecy, but she chose to double down on her pride, and she paid the final price. Each moment of ignored repentance is a lost opportunity for redemption. And fifth, perhaps the most important, no matter how long it seems that evil is winning, justice has a long memory. The prophecy about Jezebel took years to be fulfilled, but when the time came, it was fulfilled to the last detail. The wheel of justice may turn slowly, but it turns with inexorable precision. So here is the question you need to ask yourself now, today. Are you Jezebel, building your kingdom on manipulation, fear, and control? Are you Ahab, having the title of leader, but allowing others to control your decisions, choosing convenience over character? Are you the people of Israel, seeing injustice happen around you but choosing comfortable silence? Or are you Elijah, willing to stand alone against an entire kingdom, even when you are scared, even when you want to give up? Each one of us has to choose which character we will be in this story that repeats itself through time. The story of Jezebel is not just an ancient story of a distant kingdom. It is a mirror that reflects choices we still make today. Choices about power and principles, choices about pride and humility, choices about silence and courage. Each decision we make today is writing the story that will be told tomorrow. And here is the final truth that cannot be escaped. Each choice has consequences. Each action leaves a legacy. And in the end, no matter how many eyes you paint, how much hair you comb, how much appearance of power you maintain, the truth always comes to light. Justice always arrives, and the name you leave echoes far beyond your last breath. You can deceive people for a time, but you cannot deceive history, and you certainly cannot deceive eternity. Jezebel believed she would be remembered as a powerful queen, and she was remembered, but not in the way she expected. Her name became synonymous with everything she loved: manipulation, idolatry, wickedness. What cruel irony! She achieved the immortality she so desired as an eternal warning of what not to be. She wanted to be a legend, and she became one, but as the perfect example of what happens when ambition has no limits and power has no conscience. And you? What story are you writing? What name are you building? Because one day, when all is said and done, when the dogs and worms do their work, what will remain of you? Only your choices and the echo of your legacy. Not the money you accumulated, not the power you conquered, not the fame you achieved, but the character you demonstrated and the impact you left on the lives of the people around you. Choose wisely. Time is passing, and history is watching. Each moment you live is being recorded, not in paper books, but in the very fabric of reality, in the memories of the people you touch, in the impact of the decisions you make. Jezebel's story ended millennia ago, but yours is still being written. What kind of ending will you choose?